Hello and welcome to News Scope Daily TV, your trusted source for in-depth global political analysis, strategic insight, and the stories shaping tomorrow's headlines. Tonight, we turn our focus to Washington, where an extraordinary political moment is unfolding inside the United States Senate. In a development few predicted, former President Donald Trump is facing rare and growing resistance, not from Democrats, but from members of his own Republican Party. Two major confrontations have shaken Capitol Hill. The first, a dramatic clash over presidential war powers, as bipartisan lawmakers push back against aggressive foreign policy moves, including threats toward Venezuela and controversial rhetoric about Greenland. The second, a high-stakes battle over funding for the Department of Homeland Security, intensified by a tragic ICE-related shooting that has reignited debate over immigration enforcement. For years, Trump's influence over Republican lawmakers appeared firm, disciplined, and nearly unbreakable. But now, narrow Senate votes, internal divisions, and unexpected negotiations with Democratic leadership suggest something deeper may be happening. Is this a temporary disagreement, or the beginning of a structural shift within the Republican Party? Is Trump's grip on Congress weakening, or is this simply the turbulence of high-stakes governance? And what does this mean for the 2026 political landscape in the United States? Tonight, we go beyond the headlines. We examine the constitutional implications, the political calculations, the electoral risks, and the broader strategic consequences of these Senate confrontations. Stay with us as we break down what this turbulent moment reveals about power, loyalty, and the evolving balance inside Washington. You are watching News Scope Daily TV, where context meets clarity. In early 2026, Washington, long accustomed to Donald J. Trump's iron grip on the Republican Party, is witnessing a striking period of internal dissent among the GOP's own senators. Two high-stakes confrontations in the U.S. Senate, one over presidential war powers and another over funding for the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, have exposed unexpected fractures within Trump's ranks and signaled a shifting political landscape as the midterms approach. A bipartisan revolt on war powers over Venezuela. One of the most dramatic flashpoints emerged in January when the Senate moved to consider a war powers resolution aimed at curbing presidential military authority following Trump's controversial intervention in Venezuela. The resolution, championed by Democrats alongside a small group of Republicans, was designed to require congressional approval before further U.S. military actions across the Western Hemisphere, a direct challenge to Trump's expansive view of executive war authority. In a rare break with GOP leadership, 5 Republican senators initially joined all Senate Democrats to advance the measure, which would have set the stage for a final vote on limiting Trump's war powers. Those Republicans included Susan Collins, Maine; Lisa Murkowski, Alaska; Rand Paul, Kentucky; Josh Hawley, Missouri; and Todd Young, Indiana. Their action forced a deadlocked 50-50 split on a motion to dismiss the bill, requiring Vice President J.D. Vance to cast the tie-breaking vote to defeat the resolution, a stark illustration of how narrow Trump's margin of control had become even within his own party. The rebellion was not just procedural. It reflected growing unease among some Republican lawmakers about the administration's aggressive foreign policy posture, particularly after a surprise U.S. operation in Venezuela resulted in the capture of President Nicolas Maduro, spiking tensions in the region. Trump responded with public fury, attacking the dissenting senators and warning that their actions should disqualify them from future office, a rare escalation between the president and members of his own caucus. Greenland as a GOP flashpoint, adding to the turmoil was Trump's renewed fixation on Greenland, the vast autonomous Danish territory whose strategic location in the Arctic has been the subject of Trump's periodic speculation about U.S. acquisition or even full annexation. Critics on both sides of the aisle derided these comments as unrealistic and damaging to U.S. alliances, particularly within NATO. In mid-January, a bipartisan group of senators even introduced legislation to bar funding for any attempt to occupy or annex Greenland, pushing back directly against Trump's rhetoric. Polling confirms the political risk. A recent AP NORC poll showed that around 70% of U.S. adults disapproved of Trump's approach to Greenland, including roughly half of Republican voters, highlighting the issue as an unusual vulnerability for a president whose approval among his base typically remains stable. Homeland Security funding, standoff, and DHS shutdown. While foreign policy dissent simmered, another major conflict erupted domestically over funding for the Department of Homeland Security. In February, the Senate failed to pass a DHS funding bill, falling short by a 52-47 vote when Democrats walked away from negotiations. The impasse raised the specter of a government shutdown as funding for DHS was set to expire. Underlying the breakdown were deep disputes over immigration enforcement policy, compounded by intense public scrutiny after the fatal shooting of U.S. citizens by Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, agents during a high-profile enforcement surge in Minneapolis. Calls for reform, including body cameras, increased de-escalation training, and enhanced oversight, became central demands from Democratic lawmakers, who refused to support further funding without concrete changes. Some Republicans, particularly those representing more moderate or swing states, quietly signaled that enforcement tactics had gone too far and that limits should be considered. Though the funding failure emerged primarily from partisan divisions, it also revealed fissures within the GOP on how aggressively federal law enforcement should pursue immigration policy, especially when public opinion and local backlash were intensifying. The result was a partial closure of DHS operations. While critical agencies like FEMA, TSA, and the Coast Guard continue functioning under emergency provisions, around 91% of DHS staff are operating without pay, and key services are strained. Lawmakers from both parties have traded blame, with many leaving Washington for recess or international engagements rather than resolving the stalemate. A stunning call across the aisle. Amid these escalating tensions, one moment stood out as perhaps the most remarkable: President Trump making an unsolicited phone call to Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer to negotiate on DHS funding, an unexpected departure from his long-standing brand of uncompromising politics. While Trump's overture did not immediately yield a breakthrough, the outreach itself signaled a recognition of reality that without bipartisan engagement, the government faced a prolonged shutdown and intensifying political damage. For a president whose persona was built on standing firm against Democratic opposition, this marked a striking strategic pivot. Implications for Trump's GOP dominance and the 2026 landscape. Taken together, these events underline a rare weakening of Trump's once firm grip on his party's legislative machinery. A group of Republican senators openly challenged him on war powers, forced the vice president to intervene, and spurred legislation targeting controversial foreign policy ideas like Greenland. Simultaneously, disputes over Homeland Security funding and immigration enforcement exposed policy disagreements that even Trump's allies were wary of ignoring. As the U.S. moves deeper into the 2026 election cycle, these internal conflicts suggest a Republican Party wrestling with its identity, torn between loyalty to a dominant figure and a growing desire among some lawmakers to assert traditional congressional authority, respond to public backlash on social issues, and distance themselves from what many see as overreach. Whether these cracks will widen into a broader factional realignment within the GOP remains uncertain. But what is clear is that Donald Trump's influence, while still substantial, is no longer unassailable, and that Washington's turbulent political moment could reshape the American political order as much as any election. Is this a momentary rebellion, or the beginning of structural erosion? While the Senate confrontations over war powers and Homeland Security funding may appear episodic, the underlying dynamic suggests something more profound: a recalibration of power inside the Republican Party and a subtle reassertion of institutional authority against an executive-centered political model. 1. War powers, a constitutional stress test. The confrontation over Venezuela is not simply about foreign policy. It is about constitutional boundaries. For years, Congress has steadily ceded war-making authority to the executive branch. Presidents from both parties have operated under broad interpretations of the 2001 and 2002 authorizations for use of military force, AUMF. But what made this episode different was that resistance came from within Trump's own party. The 5 Republican senators who initially broke ranks were not ideologically identical. Some are traditional national security conservatives. Others are libertarian-leaning constitutionalists. What united them was concern over escalation without congressional consent, strategic unpredictability in Latin America, the precedent of unilateral executive military action. This coalition suggests an emerging Republican divide between populist executive nationalism, strong presidential authority, assertive foreign policy, rapid unilateral decisions, institutional conservatism, constitutional process, congressional authority, alliance management. The fact that Vice President J.D. Vance had to intervene with a tie-breaking vote is symbolically significant. It demonstrates that Trump's control over Senate Republicans is now numerical, not automatic. Control by one vote is not dominance. It is vulnerability. If future foreign policy crises arise, the White House can no longer assume reflexive Republican compliance. 2. Greenland and strategic overreach. The renewed rhetoric about acquiring Greenland, while dismissed by some as political theater, triggered real strategic concerns inside the GOP. Republican senators with strong defense and NATO constituencies understand that Denmark is a treaty ally. NATO cohesion is fragile amid global instability. Public annexation rhetoric can destabilize Arctic security architecture. What is emerging here is a tension between symbolic geopolitical assertiveness and practical alliance management. For some Republicans, the issue is not whether Greenland is strategically valuable. It clearly is in Arctic competition with Russia and China. But whether public acquisition talk undermines American credibility. The backlash shows that even within a party shaped by Trump's nationalist language, there are limits when rhetoric risks long-term strategic relationships. 3. Immigration and ICE. Political liability versus political identity. The tragic ICE-related shooting dramatically shifted the Homeland Security debate from abstract policy to human consequence. Immigration enforcement has long been a core pillar of Trump's political brand. However, enforcement intensity creates risk. Legal liability, public opinion backlash in suburban districts, electoral vulnerability in swing states. Some Republican senators, especially those facing competitive 2026 races, now confront a dilemma. Align fully with hardline enforcement and risk alienating moderates. Quietly support guardrails without appearing disloyal. This internal balancing act explains why the resistance has been subtle rather than confrontational. Senators are testing whether it is politically safe to recalibrate immigration rhetoric without triggering backlash from the party base. The DHS funding crisis exposed this tension. Fiscal conservatives do not want shutdowns, security hawks want robust funding, but moderates want accountability reforms. The result is paralysis, and paralysis weakens presidential leverage. 4. The Schumer call, tactical retreat or strategic shift. Perhaps the most telling moment was Trump's outreach to Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer. For a president who built his identity around confrontation, the call signals recognition of arithmetic reality. A razor-thin Senate majority, internal Republican dissent, rising public scrutiny. Negotiation here was not ideological moderation. It was institutional necessity. This moment suggests something deeper. Trump's governing style, effective when backed by strong party discipline, becomes less sustainable when party margins shrink and internal fractures grow. In other words, Trump's political power has always depended on unified Republican loyalty, fear of primary challenges, strong base approval. If even a small faction of Republican senators begins calculating that institutional independence carries less risk than total alignment, the power equation changes. 5. The 2026 midterm shadow. All of this unfolds under the looming shadow of the 2026 midterm elections. Historically, midterms often punish the president's party. Republican senators know. Swing state voters react negatively to shutdowns. Independent voters dislike foreign policy unpredictability. Suburban districts are sensitive to immigration enforcement controversies. This creates strategic hedging behavior. Senators may begin positioning themselves not as extensions of Trump, but as independent conservatives with institutional credibility. If that trend accelerates, it could reshape the GOP into a coalition with a strong populist executive wing, a re-emerging institutional conservative bloc, a pragmatic electoral survival faction that would mark the most significant internal shift since Trump reshaped the party in 2016. 6. Is Trump's grip truly weakening? It would be premature to declare collapse. Trump still commands deep loyalty among the Republican base. Primary threats remain powerful tools of discipline. Fundraising networks remain aligned with him. However, the key change is psychological. For years, opposing Trump within the GOP was politically fatal. Now it is survivable, at least for some senators. That psychological shift is more important than any single vote. A party at an inflection point. The Senate confrontations over war powers and Homeland Security funding may ultimately resolve through compromise. But the deeper signal is unmistakable. The Republican Party is entering a phase where loyalty to Trump is no longer synonymous with automatic legislative obedience. What is unfolding is not open rebellion. It is cautious recalibration. If these cracks widen, 2026 may not just be a referendum on Trump's presidency. It may become a referendum on what kind of Republican Party emerges in the post-Trump era. Executive-driven and confrontational, institutionally constrained and strategically cautious, or a hybrid model born out of necessity. For now, Washington is watching closely. The fortress has not fallen, but its walls are no longer seamless. As we conclude tonight's analysis, one thing is clear. Washington is entering a new phase of political uncertainty. The Senate confrontations over war powers and Homeland Security funding are not isolated disputes. They reflect deeper tensions between executive authority and congressional oversight, between party loyalty and institutional responsibility, and between political identity and electoral survival. Whether this moment marks a temporary fracture or the beginning of a lasting realignment within the Republican Party remains to be seen. But what is certain is that the political landscape heading into 2026 is shifting, and the consequences will extend far beyond Capitol Hill. At New Scope Daily TV, we remain committed to bringing you thoughtful, balanced, and in-depth coverage of the stories that matter, not just what is happening, but why it matters. If you found this analysis insightful, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you never miss our deep dives into global politics and strategic affairs. Please like this video to support independent analysis and share it with your friends, colleagues, and community so we can continue expanding informed conversations around the world. And most importantly, join the discussion in the comments below. Your perspective matters. Thank you for watching New Scope Daily TV. Stay informed, stay critical, stay engaged. We will see you in our next report.